Welcome to Self-Taught, where former foster youth, like myself, share our real-life experiences with sex, health, and life. Hosted by the Reproductive Health Equity Project, these are some conversations we wish we'd had earlier.
Welcome, everyone. So happy for listeners to tune in on this episode of Knowing Your Rights in Healthcare. I am pleased to be here with a fellow Youth Advisory Board member, Alexis. I have personally been a YAB member for 2 years, and I would love for Alexis, if you could introduce yourself, how long you've been on the board, and a little bit more about you.
Sure, thanks, Tamar. Hey, I'm Alexis. I don't know when I started the board, but I've been here for a while. I do a lot of advocacy and policy work. So, yeah.
I love seeing you every month in meetings, so it's nice to be here as well. And Rebecca Gudeman, the Senior Director of Health and attorney for the National Center for Youth Law, is also here to give her perspective about advocating for youth in care. Rebecca, I would love if you also could share a bit of your background, what led you to this advocacy work, and why sexual and reproductive health for foster youth is important to you.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's great to be with you too, and good to see you. So as you said, Tamar, I'm a lawyer at the National Center for Youth Law, and I hate saying this, but I've been a lawyer for almost 30 years. So yeah, I'm kind of old. But honestly, I became a lawyer just because I was pissed off at a lot of the injustice and unfairness I saw growing up. And I knew I wanted to work on youth rights, and that's all I've done. I started representing teenagers in all sorts of cases, including like teen parents who were having their rights to education or healthcare violated, or maybe they wanted to get an abortion and they were being told no at the doctor's office. And I was able to help people one at a time, but I just kept seeing the same thing happen. And that's when I moved to work at the National Center for Youth Law to try to do work on policy and lawsuits and try to change the laws themselves. And, you know, I'm a big believer that everyone should be treated with dignity. We're all human beings, right? And we should all have our bodily autonomy respected. And like I said, one of the reasons I became a lawyer is I would get pissed off at what I saw out there. And one of the things that really pissed me off over the years is seeing the barriers to sexual and reproductive health care that too many youth in foster care were facing. And then, no surprise, worse health outcomes. And those health outcomes weren't the failing of the youth, it was a failing of the systems that were meeting their needs. And everyone, you know, everyone deserves to have that information and feel empowered and feel like they can make decisions about their own body. So that's really one of the reasons that we started the Reproductive Health Equity Project, which you all are members of. And the goal is to just try to normalize and support and promote the bodily autonomy and access to sexual and reproductive health care for every single young person, including youth in foster care. So that's my story.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story. It really stood out to me too when you said the poor health outcomes, because I'm a former foster youth myself and was a teen parent, not at the same time, but I do believe that the impact of reproductive health when I was in foster care completely set me on the course to becoming a teen parent. So thank you for all the work you do. And I'm happy to just ask you, Alexis, as well. Like, do you think that young people are getting enough sexual and reproductive health education while they're in care? You know, that's such a deep conversation, but I think it's really important that we talk about it.
I feel like when it comes to certain like learning curves in foster youth lives, I feel like a lot of system agencies kind of point the finger at each other like, oh, well, you were supposed to teach them how to drive, or you were supposed to teach them how to cook, or you were supposed to teach them how to clean, or like we have ILP workers who were supposed to do that, but supposed to doesn't really help people in their future or gain healthy habits or things like that. And so I feel like just looking back, I wish there were things like Teen Talk Yes, so that people could educate themselves. When I was growing up, YouTube was mainly like funny videos and like music videos. It wasn't YouTube University like it is now. And there wasn't, for sure, it wasn't TikTok, and like Instagram used to look like an old TV. And so, like, things have changed where I feel like people can educate themselves, but it still is the responsibility of systems, of foster parents, of social workers to educate people on their rights. Because growing up in foster care, I too oftentimes had to either educate myself or just simply, thank God I was able to, but simply just go to like a Planned Parenthood and ask them to educate me. And so, yeah, I'll turn it to you, Tamar. Did you have the same experience or?
Yeah, I mean, I personally can't even remember when I had any access or information to reproductive health care and just sex ed in general. I went to a really religious school and community growing up, and I was placed into a home with a family that was also very religious. And, no one in my younger years talked to me about, the birds and the bees and the uncomfortable, the talk. And shortly after, I was placed back with my dad, who was a single dad, worked all the time. And I was basically raising myself. And he did the best he could. But again, birds and the bees, that wasn't the topic. And I was around the age of 12. And I remember I was starting to, come into my own development, and I had so many questions. And I started my period when I was in foster care. And I remember like freaking out, like I thought I was dying, because no one actually talked to me about even that. So just reflecting on all those situations, I never felt like I had anyone to go to. And the social worker, once I was placed back with my parent, it was kind of like, oh, check, like she's fine. And there wasn't a lot of like checking in on me. So, I would just resort to like, online information systems. And a lot of the stuff you find on there is not, always the best for your mental health in general. And it's not proper sex education. A lot of it's misinformation. And on top of that, a lot of it is really detrimental, to how you're going to be treated with your body. I'm not sure if you had this experience either, Alexis, but for example, when I was in foster care, the only extent I ever got was one of the puberty books. And it was, like, oh, this is what happens in puberty. It was a little cartoon, and it had like, I'm not even joking, like furry armpits, so you could like touch it, like it's for kids, like a puberty book. And I remember like getting that, and I couldn't take that seriously, like I was literally just stripped away from my home. And I received this book like months later, and that was like the gift that I was given. And I thought it was so, more humorous than serious. And sure enough, I ended up pregnant at 15. So I'm not sure if you had that experience or something similar, Alexis, but the puberty book, I feel like it's a really strong winner for like a lot of social workers to give youth and care.
Yeah, I think I'm a few years older than you. And so definitely they didn't give us, like, it really wasn't talked about at all. It was mainly forced on like the schools to talk about it. And then even then, like, they place a lot of foster youth in the Antelope Valley. And the Antelope Valley back then is not what it is now, but it still kind of carries the same values. And they're really not too keen of talking about sexual and reproductive health down there. And so it was very like base level, or like, let me show you like a woman giving birth. Like, what am I gonna do with that information? That doesn't talk about how to stay healthy. That doesn't talk about how preventing. All it talks about is like, this is a miracle of life. This is how a baby is born. Like, there's much more to sexual and reproductive health than just babies or like STDs. And so, no, I wish I would at least would have got something about that.
Yeah, I think that's really important when you mentioned to the county that you were in, Antelope Valley. For me, I was in Orange, and it's a totally different community. So I think highlighting like the values of the different counties is also going to impact how the rights are played out, and how youth do access care.
Yeah, it's crazy because like Antelope Valley is the ending. So Lancaster city limits would be the ending of LA County. So it still is LA County, but it's really not even that far. It's like an hour away, but it's so far away that like they do have their own district, they have their own curriculum. And so like people don't go and check on them. It's just like, whatever, like that's Antelope Valley, and we have to stop doing that because we got to check on all of our counties. It can't just be downtown LA in the valley. There's much more to LA County than that. But yeah, that's very true.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so important, and I really liked how you mentioned too, like the different values within what is reproductive healthcare, like it isn't just about, like babies and STDs. It's like they scare you with the STDs and then they like turn the page and it's like, oh, but this gorgeous baby. And they're not even addressing like there's people who are LGBTQ plus, there's people who don't want kids, like there's so much. I really enjoyed how you said there's so much more to that, and how your reproductive health care that can also tie into like health conditions as well, like and we're going to have another podcast diving into STDs, but for this conversation, like I think it's still applicable, right? And that leads me to the next question I have for you. Like, have you ever felt like you were respected? Like, what has your experiencing been like with accessing any healthcare? Like, did you ever feel heard or seen? Or if there's a time you didn't feel respected, I think that's really important too.
I have a social work background. And so in learning social work, there's a lot of medical racism that when I think back on it, I'm like, can I fault doctors and providers for learning? Or do you fault the systems that wrote the book? And so I wanted to choose my words wisely because I do have positive and negative experiences with doctors and Planned Parenthood and different providers. But I also realize that in the back of their mind, like it's the same thing with social work. Like because I have experience in the foster care system, I understand social work at a different lens that new social workers, people who have never experienced foster care specifically or the social work field just don't understand. And so it's the same thing. Like, do I fault them because they don't have the experience, or do I fault the schools for not teaching us well enough to support foster youth who really need it? And so I definitely have experienced medical racism. I haven't like been listened to. A lot of people don't want to go back on Medi-Cal because they're like, well, I've already had really bad experiences with it. And I've had bad experiences on Medi-Cal. I've had people tell me it didn't look like I was really in pain. I've had people, instead of like talking about like prevention or like anything, it was like, oh, here's just some birth control, don't worry about it. Like my doctor gave me something recently and it was like, oh, are you planning on being pregnant? And I was like, no. And he's like, okay, good, because this causes cleft lip in children. But it's like, if that causes cleft lip in children, what is it going to do to me? And like, you're not breaking down the side effects, you're not telling me like anything. You're just like, well, why didn't you take it? Because I want to do my own research before I just pump things in my body that already aren't tested for people of color. And so I hear a lot of like, oh, it's a doctor's fault, it's a provider's fault. But I think that it's about time that we create some legislation or change the books or start educating like RHEP did many years ago, providers and doctors and people who are higher up who can make change to make the change, because what was happening 30 years ago is just not applicable today.
Yeah, that's really powerful sentiment. I think that applies to so many areas just within this generation, but we have the power to make a difference, especially with media. So I'm really happy that you're comfortable saying those things and putting yourself in the spotlight. It's kind of like groupthink, if one person doesn't do it, then no one will do it. So thank you for sharing all of that. Like I personally have experienced different things than you, but I totally relate when it comes to having like Medi-Cal, and how you're treated by healthcare providers, and especially being a teen mom. Like I love my son to death, but to be completely honest, I don't know if I would have made the same choice, with the way that I am today. And I don't regret anything. And it's a hard concept, I think, for people to understand, when I tell people that, but it's an important one, because the brain of a 15-year-old is not the same as someone who's 22, who now has access to understanding their healthcare, which is what this whole conversation is all about. And, I can relate to just being pumped full of birth control, with no information at all. And I personally, it was less of an issue of access, but it was more of like knowing my rights, right? Like I didn't know that I didn't have to be on birth control. And I didn't know that through Medi-Cal, I can still pick a provider, right? Like I had the same terrible provider like my whole life. And it wasn't until like the past 2 years, being on this board that I realized I could choose my provider because no one told me. Like I was just in a county office applying for Medi-Cal for me and my son and said, okay, I have medical insurance, right? Like it's hard to understand the fine print of what goes into it. I'd love, Rebecca, if you could talk a little bit more about how younger foster youth and transitional age youth can use, and, even if they're applying for Medi-Cal, what are the important laws and rights that they have?
Thanks, Tamar. Both of you have brought up some really important issues that are really common, and it's part of it is making sure people do know what their rights are in the first place. So there's a lot of them. I want to just say I'm going to talk about California because it is different in different states. So if there's any listeners from other states, this may not apply to you. But if I think about sort of the top ones to hit, you all both mentioned information. So first, everyone has a right to information and sexual health education. Starting at age 10, you are supposed to be informed of your right to have your questions answered. And if you don't have a place to go and get those questions answered, your caseworker is supposed to help you find reliable places. So it doesn't mean your caseworker is going to be the person giving you the answers, but they're supposed to be able to help you connect to a Planned Parenthood or to someone else who you trust. You also have a right to get sex ed in middle school and high school. And if you don't get it through school for whatever reason, you all both mentioned that you are supposed to be connected to a program in the community. So it's really important to know that you have a right to have your questions answered. You mentioned contraception. Another really important right to know is that you have a right to make decisions about your own reproductive and sexual health care, just like every other teen in California. A lot of times people think that because you go into foster care, somehow you lose your rights or you have less rights about what happens to your body, but that's not true. So with contraception as an example, a foster youth, no matter what age they are, can decide whether to use or whether not to use contraception. And they get to decide which kind of contraception they want to use. And if you're not getting sufficient information about side effects or about how they work, another important right to know is that you do have a right to choose a different provider. You mentioned medical racism, you mentioned getting different energy from providers, whatever the reason is. If you're not feeling right about your provider, they're not giving you enough information, you do have the right to choose a different provider under Medi-Cal, and your caseworker and your caregiver are supposed to help you get transportation, even if that provider's across the county. If that's who you feel most comfortable with, you have a right to go there. Another really important right that folks often don't appreciate is a right to confidentiality. You have a right to confidentiality in your sexual health information in the doctor's office. So if you go in for contraception or a pregnancy test, your doctor cannot tell your parent, your caregiver, your caseworker, or anyone else about anything that you got or received without getting your explicit written permission. And if they do tell, they've violated your rights. And that's not necessarily true for every single healthcare service you get, but it's true for contraception and pregnancy-related care and STI care when you're 12 and older. And I think the final thing I'll say that a lot of people maybe don't appreciate, including the professionals around, is that you have a right to support from your caseworker. So if you're in a placement where you're not feeling safe, or they're not giving you access to information, or maybe they're not letting you have contraception, you have a right to be in a placement where you can have your sexual and reproductive health needs met. You have a right to transportation. You have a right to be in a place where you're not going to be treated with bias. And that's the kind of stuff that you can bring up to your caseworker if you feel comfortable with them, or your attorney if you feel comfortable with them. but you do have a right to feel comfortable and have your needs met. Another critical set of rights has to do with where you live and your placement. So, for example, your caregivers and your STRTP is required to let you obtain and keep contraception in private storage. They can't lock it away from you. Also really important, you have a right to express your sexual orientation and gender identity in your placement. And you also, another right is a right to transportation to any sexual health appointments in a timely manner. And what that means is, for example, if you think you might have a possible STI infection and you need the appointment to address the pain, they can't just say, wait a week or two until we have our group visit to the doctors. They need to address it when it needs to be addressed. And I guess there's a lot more, but we have them all listed on our website, fosterreprohealth.org. So I would say take a look at that and you'll see some of the other details.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca, for, helping me understand my rights a lot better than I did. And, from personal experience, I just never knew. No one told me. And I grew up in an area where not a lot of people came from my background. So I always felt in the shadow when it came to accessing my rights. And I remember when I had my son, my one more mentor person in my life, she was like, oh, but you were in foster care, and you're low income, so you'll get resources. And she, very privileged woman. And I remember thinking that's not how it works. You know what I mean? And it took me years to find any resources and years to learn how to apply them. So thank you for making it a lot easier for some other young person who's also navigating those circumstances. And Alexis, you talked a lot about just those rights not being enforced. I think it'd be great if you could talk more about that and what that looks like.
So listening to Rebecca kind of talk about the rights, it just reminds me of I don't know, just talking to my foster mom, and she wasn't a foster parent. She's my friend's mom, but I still call her my foster mom. And she always told me what really stood out about me is when I was talking to my social workers, it was always I know my rights. You can't do this to me. I know what my rights are. And then I would go ahead and list the rights. And so I've always been one of those people, even to this day, if I go somewhere, I don't care if it's I don't really care. I don't care if it's for something free or a piece of candy. If there's a contract involved, I'm going to read the contract. If you give me certain things, I don't read everything, but if it's about rights, if it's about laws, if it's about certain things, I learned young that as a Black person in America, we don't have the luxury to not know laws. We don't have the luxury to not know something, because for us, ignorance is extremely detrimental. And I've seen it happen. And that's why I've dedicated my life to providing resources and education to everyone, really anyone who will listen, but mainly for foster youth, because I know how valuable. It's not just about generational wealth, it's about generational knowledge. And so knowing that these are in place is amazing, at least at step one, but getting them enforced is a whole nother piece of just knowing your rights and knowing who to turn to when you need things enforced, or having those friends on your side. I have a lot of administrative friends on my side, because when stuff goes down, I'm not going to sit there and argue with anyone. I'm going to go straight to the people who are making the difference and say, hey, this is not cool. What's going on?
So, Alexis, you said something really important. You said that you didn't have a choice because of the color of your skin. You've always had to be aware of your rights and be ready to stand up for yourself. And you said that you've been doing that since you were really young. I'm curious how, when you're a 10-year-old, how did you learn about your rights? How did you know what to say and how to stand up for yourself?
Yeah, so I wouldn't really put an age cap on it. I think it was just, again, just different. I talked about this in the last podcast I was in, and just coming from a mixed background, a lot of people don't realize, a lot of people are oh my gosh, you're a social justice warrior, but it's really not that deep. It's people don't realize that interracial marriage is so new, that like, it blew my mind when I was like, what? Like these cases are like in the 90s. Like it's just crazy. And so coming from a mixed background, having a grandmother who is like insanely rich, but like hates me because I'm Black, and like hates my mom because like that's my mom. Like she's crazy. And so understanding that from a young age, and coming from a more affluent background, going to private schools, and just like having a totally different experience from what people assume the foster care experience is, already kind of like, I think about that a lot. Like, what would my life had been had I stayed in private school? What had my life had been had I never went to a private school? So things like that. And so I was always really into reading. In foster care, it was like there was really nothing else for me to do. That's why I talk about that a lot. Like people are like, how did you start volunteering at 8 in the community and planting gardens and doing community cleanups and whatever? But it was like I went to summer school because there was nothing else to do. I didn't get extracurricular activities. So I had to fill that time with something else and something meaningful. And I felt like being in the community, being educated, that was meaningful to me. And so when my social workers would tell me, like, oh, here's all this paperwork, again, I'm not just going to let you hand me paperwork. It's like, no, sit down and read it. What is this? Explain it to me. I don't care if you're going to be upset, because it's your job to explain it to me. And like I've been to car dealerships where they get upset, but it's like, okay, but when stuff hits the fan, then you're looking at me like, well, you signed a contract or you said you understood, and that's not fair. And so I am a big advocate on letting people know that, you know, it's really up to you. Take your time, educate yourself, take as long as you need to educate yourself. Force people to educate you because that's what they're there for. And if that's what they're making you sign, then you have to. And again, it's just that I don't have a luxury to be ignorant. And I can't stress that enough. Like a lot of people ask me, like, how do you have this drive? How do you know so much? How do you know all these? Because you just can't be ignorant. Like you have to be on top of like current events, what's going on, how that affects you, your rights as a human, your rights as a person. Like this is why people are fighting for the earth to stay alive and for people to stay alive, is because they know what a human right is. And so I can't urge people enough to look at their human rights, to look at like whatever class you're under, if you're a foster youth, if you're juvenile justice youth, if you're just a person living in America, what are your rights as a citizen? And from there, your mind will be blown. Like there's so much I learned just by being a citizen that you're supposed to have, but that they don't enforce because there's no laws forcing them to enforce it. And if there's nothing forcing people to enforce something, then they're not going to enforce it. And that's sad. And I know it's like, what? But that's just how life is. And it's up to you to enforce and to, I don't want to say love yourself, but love yourself enough to stand up for yourself. And like a lot of people ask me that, like, how do you become an advocate? You just have to set the barriers and stand up for yourself, period.
I wanted to ask you too, like when youth are exercising their rights, you know, and have this information, you know, going on the website and you know, looking it up if they don't know. But what are the responsibilities of the caregiver, social workers, and their supportive group and network, you know, when it comes to standing up for them? You know, it can be hard to, you know, you might know the information, but it can still be difficult to actually do something about it, right? Like we're talking, like I mentioned too, when I was 15, I did not think the way that I do at 22. So what are, you know, the responsibilities taking it off of the youth and putting it onto someone else?
Yeah, I'm super glad you said that, Tamar, because it's really easy for me to say, you have this right. But when you go to the doctor and you say, I don't want you to tell someone, and they just sort of say, ha, 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 I'm going to go tell, you know, the group home person that's in the hallway, you really can feel powerless. So it shouldn't be on the young person to have to fight for their rights. You're 100% right. For young people in foster care, your caseworker is supposed to start checking in with you at least once a year, starting at age 10, to make sure you know your rights to sexual health care and to see if you have any questions you want answered. And if you need any help, you don't have to take them up on an offer of help, but they're supposed to help facilitate any access to information or services if you need it. And if you feel like your rights aren't being honored, you do have some options. You can talk to your lawyer if you trust your lawyer. You can talk to your social worker if you trust them. If this is about your caregiver or your caseworker, you can call the California Ombuds office to file a complaint and have that reviewed. Or if this is about your STRTP, you can call the licensing office and make a complaint. If this is about treatment by a doctor, like they violated your confidentiality or treated you poorly, you can bring that to your lawyer to see if it makes sense to file a complaint. And if none of those options are working for you, you can call places like my organization, the National Center for Youth Law. And if it's not something we can help you with, we might be able to direct you to someone who can. But just because you're under 18 or just because you're a former foster youth, it does not mean that you don't have a voice. And it may take a few phone calls before you find the person who's willing to listen. You made a great point, Alexis, that, it's important to know who those people are in the system that you can trust, and it can take a while sometimes to find them, but when you do, that can really make a big difference.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Thank you for validating, us and making us feel heard, and the listeners as well. I think, everything you said, it's all flashing back to me, and I'm just remembering all the times where, I came across these situations and still do, and trying to find my voice. So thank you for giving, the voice to those who have a hard time finding it. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. I hope you gathered something from this conversation. And if you want to hear more about reproductive health care and what that looks like, we're going to have episodes talking about birth control access, STI, STD prevention, and would love for you to join in.
Thanks for stopping by. To hear more and support our cause, like this video and subscribe to our channel. And check out fosterreprohealth.org for more resources.